Iniciamos agora o 5º dia do segundo UTCAL Summit Online de 2021. É um evento destinado aos profissionais de telecomunicações e tecnologia das utilities. Assistiremos a apresentações sobre temas regulatórios e tecnologias de ponta para a modernização das utilities. Estamos com o horizonte da pandemia, mas, claro, por causa da vacinação, e esperamos que em breve não haja impedimentos para que a realização do nosso summit presencial. Tal evento está previsto para o período de 29 de março a 1º de abril de 2022. Temos muito a apresentar e discutir nesse summit. Desde março de 2020, as atividades técnicas e regulatórias no país e no mundo não sofreram paralisação. O 5G está batendo na nossa porta e a segurança cibernética não deu trégua. Tanto tivemos ataques, quanto foram tomadas providências para a contenção. Sistemas de supervisão e controle foram e estão sendo instalados. Sistemas de telecomunicações próprios estão implantados ou em fase de implantação. Novos regulamentos foram desenvolvidos, discutidos por meio de consultas públicas e emitidos. Novidades estão em toda parte e não só no Brasil, mas tanto nos países latino-americanos quanto na América do Norte, Ásia ou Europa. A UTCAL tem como missão divulgar novas tecnologias, novas soluções e representar os seus membros diante dos órgãos reguladores. Agradecemos a todos os associados, patrocinadores e parceiros que nos ajudaram a construir mais um summit, o que mostra que continuamos no caminho certo. Também agradecemos a todos os panelistas que se dispuseram a compartilhar conosco seus conhecimentos, suas experiências e seu tempo, especialmente em um momento tão desafiador. Muito bem. Eu agora gostaria de apresentar os nossos panelistas desta tarde. Eu sou Cláudio Batista, vou ser o moderador dessa sessão e eu tenho a satisfação, então, de passar a apresentação dos nossos panelistas. Bom, o primeiro aqui na minha lista é o Brett Kilborn, que é Vice President, Policy and General Counsel da Utilities Technology Council em Washington, D.C. O Sr. Kilborn, ele é, como eu disse, vice-presidente da parte de políticas e é o, digamos, General Counsel, diretor jurídico da UTC América. E nessa função ele presta orientação jurídica para as empresas de utilities na parte relativa a telecomunicações, incluindo gestões junto aos reguladores estaduais, o regulador federal norte-americano, o FCC, e como também nas gestões junto ao Congresso norte-americano. O próximo na minha lista aqui é Julian Stafford, que é diretor técnico da European Utilities Telecoms Council. Ele tem uma sólida experiência na área de telecomunicações, incluindo, digamos, vários trabalhos na área de banda larga rural e comunicações de emissão crítica para empresas de utilities no Reino Unido. O nosso próximo speaker é o Sr. Gosta Kallner, que é Chairman da 450 MHz Alliance. Além de Chairman dessa aliança, que é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos, digamos, é uma aliança da indústria e de operadores que atuam nessa faixa de frequências. Ele também é Managing Director da Edcom Sweden, uma empresa do grupo Celnex. O senhor Gosta tem mais de 30 anos de experiência em telecom e já esteve envolvido com muitos projetos de implementação de redes na Europa, na Ásia e na região Américas. Nosso próximo speaker na lista é o senhor Julián Gómez Pineda, que é sócio fundador da Tation Consultores da Colômbia, O senhor Julián tem mais de 25 anos de experiência em gerência e consultoria em várias indústrias, com ênfase em tecnologia da informação e telecomunicações e com experiência no setor elétrico, logístico e de mobilidade. O nosso próximo speaker, que eu gostaria de apresentar, é o senhor Celidônio von Futenal. Ele é Head de Relações Governamentais para a América Latina da Nokia. Como todos sabemos, é um provedor, digamos, sobejamente conhecido de infraestrutura de redes de telecomunicações, software e serviços. Finalizando, o nosso próximo e último speaker é o senhor John Yaldwin, que é Chief Technology Officer e fundador da 4RF da Nova Zelândia. O senhor Yaldwin tem experiência em design a nível de sistemas de radiofrequência e segurança cibernética e é membro do Conselho Consultivo da Faculdade de Engenharia da Universidade de Victoria de Wellington, na Nova Zelândia. Bom, com isso, eu gostaria de, como último anúncio aqui, dizer que cada apresentador, eles já estão avisados, terá de 15 a 18 minutos para a sua apresentação. E, ao final de todas as apresentações, nós passaremos, então, para uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Ok? Então, agora, eu vou passar para o inglês agora, para poder me comunicar com os nossos speakers. Now, I'll turn to English, and I kindly request our speakers to turn off the video, okay? And I'll be calling one by one for your presentations. Okay? Thank you. So now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Brett Kilborn, and I'll turn the floor to Brett for his presentation. Brett, please, you are kindly invited to make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clovis. It's a pleasure to be back speaking again with you at the UTC America Latina Summit. This is a really important topic, and what I'm going to try and cover in my portion of this set of presentations is the UTC's efforts to access international harmonized spectrum for utilities. So let me go ahead and advance. So in terms of the agenda, I'll talk a little bit about UTC for folks that are not familiar with UTC, and then also how what we do fits into utility spectrum access in general. Then I'll turn to a description of some of the key drivers, why utility companies are looking to get access to international harmonized spectrum to be able to support their communication needs. Then we'll turn into a description about the International Telecommunications Union and the Inter-American Telecommunications Association, which is CTEL, and what we're doing there. And then finally, we'll talk about what we're doing within ITU and CTEL, and then how that fits into our global spectrum strategy. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we go from here in terms of spectrum access. So a little bit of background about UTC. We were founded in 1948. We're the only association that just represents the telecom and IT interests of electric, gas, and water utilities. While there are other trade associations that represent energy interests and water interests and gas interests, UTC is relatively unique in the sense that we represent all types of utilities, but specifically for their telecom and IT interests. And second bullet point, UTC has affiliates, and UTC America Latina is one of them, and the European Utilities Telecom Council is another one. So we work together, and we'll talk about what we're doing together when it comes to these efforts internationally. Third bullet point, the one common denominator for for utilities, regardless of their type, is that they all tend to own, manage, and operate extensive internal communication networks. And these private internal communication networks are essential for ensuring the safe, reliable, and secure delivery of electric, gas, and water services. So while there are wireline communication networks that utilities use, what we're going to be focusing on is the wireless networks that utilities use. And spectrum is essential for utilities worldwide. Specifically, utilities are needing access to additional spectrum to support increasing coverage and capacity requirements for these clean energy and smart water initiatives that policymakers and the industry are trying to support. But at the same time that they have these increasing demands, utilities lack access to suitable spectrum, especially in frequency ranges below 2 gigahertz that would support wideband or broadband channels, and which would support standardized equipment using those channels. So that brings us to a high-level description illustration of what we're dealing with. Whereas in the past, utility infrastructure was relatively simple in terms of the flow of electricity downstream. Now we have an increasing array of new applications that are coming online, including EV charging stations, distributed energy resources such as solar, wind, etc. And these are representing a new challenge for utilities as they try to become more efficient, reduce carbon emissions, but at the same time manage all these new applications, which, quite frankly, in some cases, require better control than they have in the past. And secondly, involve two-way flows of electricity back and forth, not just downstream to the consumer. So this is an illustration of the typical type of utility communication network, which is composed of a WAN, wide area network, a field area network, or FAN, and a neighborhood area network, which is inside the house principally. For purposes of this discussion around spectrum access, the area that really is the gap right now for utilities is that field area network. So utilities do have wireless communication systems, but those communication systems are predominantly characterized by narrowband operations, and they tend to be in disparate, different frequency ranges. And so that creates a number of different challenges in terms of capacity requirements and interoperability between these different wireless communication systems. What utilities want to get to is more of a unified communication network that would be able to support not just narrowband wireless communications, but also broadband. So that brings us to where we are right now in terms of our engagement with the International Telecommunications Unit, or the ITU. So I thought it'd be good for us to provide a little bit of background about the ITU. So there are different sectors within the ITU. There's the development sector, the radio communications sector, and the telecommunications standards sector. The one that we're focusing on in terms of wireless is the ITU-R, the radio communications sector. And that's where we're engaging. But the ITU, basically, for regulatory purposes, makes recommendations in terms of the allocation of frequency spectrum for radio communication services, which involve the transmission, emission, and/or reception of radio waves for specific telecommunications purposes. So turning to the ITU-R, there are a number of different sub-study groups within the ITU-R and they're listed there, as you see from left to right: SG1, SG3, SG4, SG5, SG6, and so on. The one that I want to focus on for purposes of our engagement is SG5, Study Group 5. And then you'll see underneath Study Group 5, there are a number of different efforts within Study Group 5, including the Working Party 5A, which is focusing on spectrum in the land mobile services below 30 megahertz, including wireless access in the fixed service and the amateur services. So drilling down a little bit further, within Working Party 5A, there are different working groups. And there again, I want to focus in on the second one that's listed here, which is Working Group 5A2, which is entitled Systems and Standards. And you'll see that in that highlighted portion there, that is where the ITU has decided to place the utilities spectrum allocation efforts, and that's where the work is taking place by UTC and UTCAL. All right, so turning to CTEL, which is a regional group within the umbrella, if you will, of the ITU. There again, there's a number of different organizations within the structure. I've focused in on the PCC2 within CTEL, and specifically, you'll see I've put a little pointer to the working group on terrestrial services, which is where our efforts are engaged right now in terms of utility access to spectrum. But the PCC2 is the group within CTEL that is focused on radio communications issues. And their purpose is to promote debate and regional cooperation on issues related to the planning and harmonization and efficient use of radio spectrum, as well as geostationary and non-geostationary satellite orbits for radio communication services. So, quick summary slide of where we've been in terms of our engagement with both ITU and CTEL. We started out in 2015 engaging with CTEL. First meeting there was in Ottawa, Canada. It was more or less, an introduction, not just for UTC, but for the other administrations that were engaged with CTEL about the whole question of utility spectrum access. Because quite frankly, most of the groups, if not all, are focused on commercial wireless. So utilities were sort of a different animal within this group. And so the good news there was that, despite being somewhat unique, we were welcomed by the group within CTEL, and we submitted a proposal for a draft new question. And as a result of that, the CTEL group agreed to form an electronic correspondence group, and that's chaired by UTC, to focus on this effort. There have been a number of meetings that UTC has participated in since that first meeting in 2015 with CTEL. I think it's I think we're up to 12 now meetings that we've participated in. Each year there are 2 different CTEL meetings. But when we went to the meeting in Barranquilla, Colombia, UTC, interestingly enough, was the first organization, I believe, to host this kind of workshop, which featured and educated the participants on the whole question of utility spectrum and utility communication networks. And so we had representatives from EUTC, UTCAL. We also had equipment manufacturers that participated in this workshop. So it was a pretty comprehensive initiative, and was successful in terms of raising awareness about our issues. Because like I said, most of the folks in the room were focusing on commercial wireless. So after that experience, we joined ITU to increase our international efforts. And that first meeting was in Geneva. Since that time, we've had a number of other meetings with ITU. And like I said, as a result of those meetings, we've been engaged with the Working Party 5A. And we've made some significant progress, which I'll talk about, in terms of introducing reports and getting administrative input into those reports. And then most recently, in CTEL, the electronic correspondence group was elevated to a full rapporteur group. So that was a pretty significant milestone, where now this issue of utility access to spectrum is now somewhat of a more permanent feature within the CTEL discussions. And then secondly, within ITU, most recently in May of 2019, the document that I was initially just a draft is now a working document towards a preliminary draft document, new document, that would serve as the basis, I think, for a recommendation ultimately within ITU in terms of utility access to spectrum. So let me turn to the last couple of slides here in terms of the current status of where we are. First, within ITU in the WP5A, we have a working document towards a preliminary draft new report. And I provided some links here in case you all want to check these reports out. They are public. There is also most recently a work plan for the working document, and that is part also of the chairman's report and is publicly accessible. I've cut and pasted a table showing some of the immediate next steps that are going to be taking place under that work plan. So as you can see, we've got a meeting coming up in November. At that meeting, we're going to continue to work on this preliminary draft new report and taking into account feedback from some of the contributing groups, which I must emphasize is very important. If we don't get input from some of these other administrations, it's very hard to make progress and get the reports approved. And as we get those changes, we will incorporate them, and also we'll get feedback from some other groups within ITU, and to facilitate those kind of collaborations, there is liaison statements between those contributing groups. And then finally, our next step in terms of the work plan at the next meeting is to modify the work plan if needed. So that would take us to the meeting in the spring of 2022. Our plan there is to continue to develop this preliminary draft new report, transmit that new report to contributing groups, and then modify the work plan as needed. And then ultimately, when we get to the second half of 2022, we hope to be able to complete the draft new report. And that would then serve as the basis for, as I said, a possible recommendation in terms of utility access to spectrum. Down at the bottom there, I've got another table that most importantly shows that not only is this next meeting in November, but the deadline for submitting contributions is November 8th. So that's what we're working against in ITU. And then meanwhile in CTEL, a lot of the stuff that's at the beginning is we've already covered. There was most recently a 37th PCC2 meeting that was held between April 5th and 9th. These meetings now are taking place virtually just because of COVID. During that meeting, a new work plan was approved and our updated report was submitted. So the current work plan for this utilities rapporteurship is between now and the next meeting, which is coming up in November, to hold 2 virtual meetings that would be attended by representatives from administrations in the Americas, in North America and South America. And these meetings would be designed to develop a questionnaire and then submit that questionnaire for discussion and approval at the next meeting of PCC2 in the second half of 2021. And in addition to that, we'll work on information documents and update the PCC2 on related utility communications systems, and then identify next steps going forward. So I guess the bottom illustration there is pretty important. We have already scheduled these webinar meetings to take place September 22nd and October 6th. If there are folks in the audience that are representatives of administrations within CTEL, we're encouraging everyone to participate in those meetings and provide your input, which, as I said, is very important towards moving this, making progress within CTEL. And so wrapping up here, why does this matter? For a number of different reasons. Most importantly, the recommendations that come out of the ITUR, WP5A, and PCC2 tend to be followed by individual member countries, and they're considered by the World Radio Communications Conference, which takes place every 4 years and makes recommendations worldwide for spectrum allocations. So those WRC recommendations also are typically followed by individual member countries. And so to the extent that we are successful in shepherding our work through the various different ITU and CTEL groups to the WRC, hopefully that will result in a worldwide allocation of spectrum for utilities. Like I said, UTC is the only utility industry representative in these meetings. So, it's a challenge for us, but we're fighting the good fight and trying to, promote access for utilities. And then finally, our goal is to obtain global harmonized spectrum allocation for utilities. So with that, I'll conclude and I'll turn it back over to you, Clovis, and then we can go from
there. Thank you very much, Brett, for your very interesting presentation. And I commend your work as a rapporteur of the question on spectrum for utilities in CTEL, and also your participation in the ITUR Working Party 5A. And I've been following this work since I was working in CTEL. And I think that the most important thing related to this participation is that we were able to raise awareness of regulators and industry players of the particular needs of utility companies. I think that it's a very important thing, and through this participation, I think that at the very end, we could reach the goal of having globally harmonized frequency bands for utility companies worldwide. So I hope that we could reach this level of conformity someday. Now, I'd like to turn to our next speaker, that is Mr. Julian Stafford, the representative from the European Utilities Telecommunications Council. Julian, you have the floor now.
Thanks very much, Clovis. I'll just hopefully share the slides. This will work smoothly. Just give those a few moments to come through and get those to full scale. Okay, Clovis, are you getting those slides now? Okay, so thanks to Clovis and the team for inviting me along this evening to the event. I hopefully we'll eventually actually get to Rio in person. I still have a voucher from KLM from last year when I was due to travel to Rio in March. That's still valid. Eventually we can travel around. And thanks as well to Brett for setting the scene there. He did an excellent job. This is actually Brett and I's second presentation together today. We were on the monthly EUTC Spectrum call about 6 hours ago. So yes, we do share experiences and knowledge across the Atlantic and around the globe. So just to say a few words about EUTC, we are effectively the equivalent of UTC here in Europe, and work very closely with our cousins in America, in South America, in Africa, and in Asia as well. You'll see we actually got a shiny new website just recently, so please, anyone, feel free to have a look at that. There's a lot of really interesting content on the new website there. Okay, so this just gives you a quick overview of who EUTC are. Some of this will kind of echo what Brett has just said about UTC in terms of representing technical and regulatory interests with the whole utility sector throughout Europe. We have some specific issues here in Europe in the way that regulation is implemented. Of course, much comes from Brussels at high level. But then a lot of this is not actually a legal requirement. It becomes recommendations that can be implemented from Greece to Italy, from Spain to Malta, and anywhere in between. And so we have to have individual relationships with each of the energy regulators and spectrum regulators in all of those countries. So quite often something which may appear a simple EU-wide task is actually much complicated by the fact that we've got to speak to 20 odd different regulators, all in their own local languages as well. You'll see some of the members dotted around the outside of the screen there as well. ESB in Ireland, NL in Italy, Iberdrola, of course, in Spain, and some of our associates at the bottom there, which will be familiar names. When we look at the size and scale of some of the European operators, hopefully these will be familiar to our colleagues in Brazil, in that the Italian operator Enel and EDP in Portugal and Iberdrola, of course, have all got very significant operations in Brazil and further afield. And again, this echoes what Brett was mentioning, that organizations look for globally harmonized solutions. Nobody really wants to have a different solution in every different country in the world where they operate. So if we can harmonize as far as possible, and this goes across a whole range of things, whether it's fiber optic systems, multiplexers, IP equipment, cybersecurity, but of course the most challenging one is radio spectrum. That's very, very hard because of the background from which these allocations came, sometimes 40 or 50 or even 60 years ago. I would just mention at the bottom left there, you'll see Scottish Power, and I've specifically indicated there, they're the principal partner for COP26. COP26 is the conference of the parties. It will be held in Glasgow this year. This is the whole kind of driver behind so much of our change, is about decarbonising the energy sector. So if we didn't have climate change objectives, we probably wouldn't be needing to do very much with our energy sector at the moment. So of course, the fact that we've got COP26 here in the UK in Glasgow is an opportunity for us to get some additional exposure around the cause, and reminds us very much that the events that we've seen just this week in Louisiana and New York, and 6 or 7 weeks ago in Germany, are pretty much undisputed to be the direct result of climate change. So I thought we would mention that, because when we need political traction for some of what we need to do, those events are very useful to be aware of, and we have to start moving in a political sphere as well as merely a technical sphere. So I covered some of this already and talked about it in the first slide, but some of the other people that we work with here include, of course, our UTC partners around the globe. Sometimes it makes sense to work together on issues like ITU, like 3GPP, like cybersecurity. Other things get dealt with more locally, where they're only relevant to one particular country or one part of the world. But we also work closely with other partners, such as the TCCA and the 450 MHz Alliance. So again, this is recognition that there are other people in the critical communications community who've got more capability in some areas than the utility sector have got, or there are things that they've already done which we can learn from and make everybody's journey towards enhanced communications a little less painful, and not use resource doubling up on activities that have already been completed. So I should say that TCCA is very helpful in terms of examining the journey which the emergency services started maybe 25 years ago in moving away from fragmented analog PMR systems into a harmonized digital Tetra system, and eventually in migration from that into broadband systems for the emergency services sector. So there are some interesting technical and organizational lessons to be learned there. And actually we just published with TCCA the other week a SCADA group which talks specifically about how legacy SCADA and narrowband systems might be handled as they migrate away into different forms of connectivity, away from TDM and PDH based systems into broadband connectivity. Because the reality is both narrowband and broadband systems are going to be around in parallel for quite some years to come, and that presents its own challenges as well. I should mention the 450 Alliance there, because much of the work we're doing in developing chipsets in 3GPP, standard bands, and bringing some of the larger players to the utility market is dependent upon them having confidence that there's a big enough market to sell these devices into. Otherwise, we will fall flat on our faces very, very quickly. And of course, at the bottom there, you see some of the more localized European organizations, ETSI, CEPT, ECO, and so on. It's perhaps quite an observation that the European Union seems to have some of the most ambitious climate change objectives of anywhere in the world, and does seem to be moving ahead quite quickly on those things. And one thing that is maybe worth mentioning as well, of course, Brett's indicated the engagement we have with ITU in all three regions of the world. And we should remember that ITU itself is part of the United Nations, and the United Nations are the people who signed the Kyoto Agreement, the Paris Agreement, and so on, which drive the climate change objectives. So sometimes these things are worth dropping into the opening paragraphs of some of our documents and submissions, that we're doing this for a very important reason. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide here. So this is a slide and a triangle that many of you will be familiar with. You may have seen it in the context of 5G networks and so on. It's the IMT 2020 triangle. Up on the top left there, media hype and excitement. This is essentially what we've almost got now in terms of 5G connectivity for consumers. So I'm sure that very soon I'll be watching Cristiano Ronaldo score his next goal at Manchester United on my mobile phone. But this isn't really of much use to utilities. Utilities are interested in the bottom left and the bottom right of that triangle, and you will see in the bottom right there, of course, SCADA, automation, teleprotection, and so on. Further up on the right, there are other nice to have things like CCTV and augmented reality. It would be great if we ever get those things, but for now, we really need to concentrate on the bottom right and bottom left. And of course, the reason that this triangle looks familiar to many of us is that that's exactly what we have now with historically with some of our narrowband systems have been providing that type of relatively low bandwidth connectivity at low latency. The challenge that we've got now is a 10 or 100 or 1,000-fold increase in the number of devices that we need to manage, and huge increases in the amount of data that we'll be bringing to these connections as well. And so collaboration is essential from both the government and regulatory side, the utility members themselves, utilities who struggle to figure out exactly what's the best way to go with this. Should I invest more in the system I've got? Should I wait for the future system and technology to be available? It's a difficult challenge, and we have to bring along standards, markets, and regulators all into the ecosystem to make this work. So we have a lot of work cut out ahead of us here, and on the idea around 5G and 3GPP based solutions, just to remind everyone that although much of the hype talks about 5G and private 5G networks solving all the challenges for things like railways, education, medicine, and utilities, those solutions will only exist if those industry sectors or verticals actually contribute to the development of the LTE standards, and that's quite an undertaking in itself, as we'll see in a minute. Going back to Spectrum, the last 2 years have been phenomenal in terms of the journey which we all started maybe about 10 years ago, which has been gathering pace over the past 5 years to obtain greater spectrum allocations, preferably in the sub 1 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz spectrum range, and to have wider allocations standardized around the globe. And of course, this is what Brett alluded to before, with work really taking on a new pace and a new momentum in about 2014, 2015. So this was a statement last year by Ursula von der Leyen, who was the incoming president of the European Commission, the role of spectrum policy to help combat climate change. This is an absolute, a fantastic quotation, a fantastic piece of work that says, okay, if we don't get spectrum policy right, potentially not how do we help climate change, but if we don't get this right, we jeopardize our efforts to combat climate change, or we end up with a less reliable or more expensive energy network. So there were 3 key items at the bottom there: climate change related aspects and spectrum management. How can we use spectrum policy to combat climate change, and what actions need to be taken at EU level? So there was actually a response back from EUTC on this piece of work, which you can view on the EUTC website. But essentially, this has started a whole chain of events, which now allows further in-depth discussion within the European Union, and actually meetings directly with 3 or 4 members of European Parliament now, for EUTC and some of our key members to explain to the politicians in Brussels why this is important, and why if we don't get this right, all of those other objectives are in jeopardy. So all of a sudden, we're not merely technical people and radio spectrum people and engineers anymore. We're starting to have to move in the political spheres, which is quite a new and challenging area for me as well, because it wasn't what I thought I'd be doing when I started climbing radio towers 30 years ago. Okay, so this is just a very quick sample of some of the consultations we've had over the past 18 months. Consultations especially focus around 400 megahertz from Slovakia, Norway, Spain, Greece, Saudi Arabia. Colombia I've listed there as well. I won't mention too much about that because I think we've got a presentation from a gentleman, Julian Gomez, later on in the session. Czech Republic are moving in this direction as well as Portugal, Holland, and the UK. You can look at all of these consultations and our responses on the website. It is quite a task to keep responding to all these, and we're very fortunate that we've got members in most of those countries who can actually help out with the translation, because although most regulators will accept responses in English, I think it always carries more weight if we're able to have them in the language local to the individual regulator. These are live activities taking place during July and August, so even during the summer months here in Europe, this hasn't stopped. So there was a piece of work issued by the Radio Spectrum Policy Group in Brussels in June. We actually responded to that last Friday, so I think we put a good solid response to that, which indicates again the need to have radio spectrum policy aligned with utility transitions and the evolution to the smart grid, which itself is essential to decarbonise the energy sector. And we were able to make direct reference to various climate change reports which have been issued recently and the upcoming work of COP26. I think our biggest issue with the initial publication from RSPG was that they were talking about technology neutral solutions and spectrum neutral solutions, so almost suggesting that each individual EU state could allocate any spectrum that it wanted for utilities. And of course, that really would drive some costs in the wrong directions if manufacturers, whether that be 4RF, whether that be Ericsson, whether it be anybody else, have got to make a different version of their equipment for every country. That's not a way that you're going to get economies of scale throughout the EU. So we responded quite strongly to that. The other document on the right there, I was quite pleased to see a piece of work published through the UK Spectrum Policy Forum 2 or 3 weeks ago, has now confirmed that they've engaged a private external consultant, Plum Consulting, who are going to advise the UK government on which part of the spectrum band they should make available here in the UK. Unfortunately, in the UK, there's no low-hanging fruit. Any potential spectrum which could be made available for utilities will mean that some other users have to be moved elsewhere. But if we've got to do that, and that's important enough, then the government can instruct for that to be done. So yeah, there's some work taking place there in a short time scale. In fact, the findings will be presented on the 21st of October, and there's a link at the bottom there. Anyone can register that if they're interested to see what comes out the other end of that piece of work. Should mention as well, slightly further afield than Europe, but very, very progressive activity from CITC in Saudi Arabia. Yoshton might make comment on this later on from the 450 Alliance, but essentially 2 huge swathes of spectrum there, which are going to be allocated for mission critical activities. Perhaps this isn't surprising, given that Saudi are perhaps a little more autonomous than other parts of the world, but also, of course, their massive involvement in the petrochemical sector and their desire to be very progressive when we look at the move towards 5G technologies, private networks, and the entire mission critical sector. So coming towards some of the final few slides now, what we've achieved in Europe goes beyond merely a talking shop or discussions and consultations. We started a little earlier than some other parts of the world on this, but in chronological order, you can see there in September 2 years ago, we were in Warsaw, and there was an announcement that PGE, the largest power company in Poland, had been awarded 450 to 470 megahertz range of spectrum. So I think they got 2 times 5 meg in that range, and they're now out for procurements on how to build a national network based on LTE solutions to allow them to control their grid in the future. And we just heard about 6 weeks ago that now the second largest power company in Poland has also joined that consortium. Just a few weeks after that, in November 2019, through work which the same consultant in London, Plum, did with the regulator in Ireland, this was Comreg, decided that they should award spectrum to ESB for a utility network on a national basis. Again, the procurement is still underway for that, and we expect to start to see activity taking place quite soon in the Republic of Ireland. In July last year, our colleagues in Spain, after a lot of work with the regulator, were successful in getting a dedicated allocation in the 2.3 gig band, so not quite as low in frequency as we would wish in the ideal world, but clearly response there from the regulator in Madrid that 2.3 gigahertz has got an allocation for critical applications in the water, gas and electricity sector. And potentially one of the biggest successes of all, Germany being the largest single economy in the European Union, was the award in March this year in the 450 to 470 megahertz band, which has gone to a consortium led by 450 Connect. So this would be a nationwide LTE network, which essentially all of the utility companies in Germany will buy capacity on that network for the next 15 to 20 years. And this includes not only the grid level, so the medium voltage and low voltage levels, but also the smart metering infrastructure as well can be connected to this network. So in fact, there will be an event coming up in Germany in 3 or 4 weeks' time where we hope to get some updates on the progress of the construction of that network. So some next steps. Well, we've already come a long way, and we're very keen to share our experiences and work with all utilities and vendors around the world, because we realise that only by having scale to this type of operation and expansion can we attract the interest of the people that we need to deploy and provide the equipment. So we'll continue our engagement with Anatel, of course, in Brazil, FCC in the States, the teams in Prague, France, and further afield. It was good as well that Brett mentioned the ITU work, and of course there's activity in Working Party 1A, which is led by Ofcom, and 5A, and there are liaison statements between those two activities. And we do engage with regulators around Europe and make sure that they're aware of these activities, so that those who are more proactive can actually lend their support, because as Brett indicated, without the support of key players in ITU, your ideas could be the best in the world, but unless you convince other people, they will probably run into the buffers and not go the way you would like them to. So we have a lot of work as well underway within 3GPP. This is something that EUTC started only about 12 months ago. It's now gained a lot of traction. We've actually got work items in 3GPP and a lot of interest from major players, support from Samsung and Ericsson, Qualcomm and various others. But this is something which now it's grown to a larger scale. We have to figure out the best way to resource this activity because it's very complex. And along with any work in 3GPP or anything based on LTE networks, whether they be partially private or entirely private or a hybrid of both, you need to have this other whole range of capability connected to profile management, SIM cards, mobile network codes, and so on, which is not trivial. In fact, it starts to look almost as complex as spectrum access. So we continue our engagement with MEPs as well, and use all the powers that are in our capability and all our tools to try to drive decisions in the right direction there. And I would mention as well that there was an excellent session at the end of June, which was hosted by WPD in the UK, which demonstrates a very capable trial deployment with Nokia and Encore and 2 or 3 other vendors in there using test and development spectrum. The video is available at the link at the bottom, as are the slides. It's a very, very high quality video production. I think it would be useful for anyone to watch that, or feel free to share it in conversations with your regulators. It's been put together very effectively. It's free of charge. The team in WPD are very keen that that gets shared widely, and anybody else in the world can use that to help their own internal argument. Just a couple of other items there that could be worth reading if you have the time. I thought it worth mentioning Alberto Sendin's book there, which he jointly wrote with Inigo and Javier and a couple of the other guys from within Iberdrola. There's some excellent content in there. I think actually Alberto did a presentation on this very series of webinars, but yesterday afternoon, I think. And of course, yes, there's an EUTC link there to the document about don't believe the hype on 5G. It's got a long way to go, and it doesn't yet do everything that we need it to do, or in some cases, it doesn't do very much at all of what we would wish it to do. So please feel free to have a look at the new EUTC website. There's a lot of content on there, quite a few forthcoming events as well, which people are generally free to attend, especially on the webinar format. Again, thanks to Clovis and the team for inviting me. I'll hand back to you, Clovis. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian, for your excellent presentation. We follow closely the great work that European UTC is advancing, the dialogue with the energy and telecommunication regulators, industry players, policymakers. So I think that at the very end of the panel, we have some interesting questions related to your presentation. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to our next speaker, that's Mr. Gösta Kallner, Chairman of 405th MHz Alliance. Gösta, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna make sure that I get my presentation up here as well.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I would also send my gratitudes to UTC Latin America for having us here. We have been working quite a lot with utilities over the last couple of years, I would say, and UTC has been one of our main partners, but I will come to that. I thought I'd do a very brief round on 450 Alliance and the background of this organization, because it might not be completely clear for everybody and where we come from and why we are here talking on utility event. 450 Alliance background, we actually come, the original organization was AI 450 for 1G during the analog days, then evolved to CDG 450, which was part of the CDMA development group for the 2G, 3G era. And then when actually Brazil started looking at 450 for LTE, we evolved the group to 450 Alliance to be more neutral from a technology point of view rather than tied to CDMA. And we also evolved a little bit the structure, where we set it up a standards regulatory group. We had a technical work group and a commercial work group to evolve and make sure that all the different topics that those required to evolve the business that we had seen from 1G now up to 4G. And we also already start working and looking at, of course, evolving to other technologies within this domain as well. What we have had all the time is we're trying within these groups to keep to standards. And we have gone through always standard bands within ITU or different IMT bands. And today we have 5 bands in the 400 megahertz, both in 450 and 410, that we have standardized and are available globally from a standardization point of view, at least. Band 31 was the first, which we actually was a Brazilian specific band from start, but now I think it's been commonly deployed in many parts of the world. A little bit on the background there. I mean, we're coming from a 1G perspective with analog voice services. We went into 2G, 3G, which became rural voice and light data services. And I think with 4G and what we see on our membership over time, when you're looking at our members today, a lot of them are utility driven, or I would say driven into the industrial segment and dedicated networks. We have everybody from Motorola and Utility Connect, 450 Connect, and so on, that are utility operations or create dedicated networks for utilities, as well as we have GE and others, and Hitachi ABB being part of this organization. And you can also see that on our partners, because what previously were more partners in rural communication and for schools and maybe for more telephony services. Today, we partner up quite a lot with TCCA on the Critical Communication Association, and also with UTC or UTC in these kind of events, and also cooperating in all the work we've done in ITU and other standardizations. Deployments today, we are still a very small community, especially when it comes to that we actually evolve still. And also that usually have one, or in some cases now we start seeing 2 licenses on the 400 megahertz bands globally per country. Historically, it's usually been 410 or 450. Now we see more and more places. We have seen, I think the first one out with really 2 licenses, 1 operator, was Argentina, where we now see the first deployments with both spectrums in 1 operator. We have approximately today 100 plus spectrums, I would say, available either in consultations or in deployment or already deployed in these bands. And dominant is still 450 when it comes to what we're looking for 3GPP standardized spectrum or 3GPP2 standardized spectrum. Covering today approximately 85% of the global population, 6.6 billion people. And I would not say that everybody has the coverage, but potential coverage, I should say. And networks deployed on these spectrums, I would say quite a lot of the other are evolving, are about 52% of the global population. So it's a decent amount of spectrum available globally in these spectrums, which we've encouraged, and we're trying to drive and make it even coming closer and closer to 100% as fast as we can. Where are these deployments? Yeah, they are quite around the whole globe. They're not specific. If you're looking here, just to differentiate, the red ones are 410, the blue ones are 450, but we usually try to see it as a potential single band or a band that facilitate the same services within these bands. As I stated earlier, I mean, the big shift we see here is really coming into industry and dedicated, rather than being rural broadband applications or I would say voice communications. And that comes with going from CDMA into LTE with better capabilities on bandwidth, and also I would say simpler and cheaper networks to build in comparison to the legacy networks. But you also see there's a long way to go. We are starting to get the LTE networks rolling, but we expect that the CDMA networks, we hope to speed up this process, I should say. We are trying to, and we're trying to advertise this, because I would say, especially in countries where you're sitting on CDMA, it's a problem with evolving it to tech neutral licenses rather than CDMA or other technology licenses. And we're really trying to promote that evolvement in these spectrum, and also get the knowledge so people actually know that there are different technologies available for them to evolve into. And why are we driving this? I mean, there are plenty of technologies in the 450 space, everything from the PMR all the way up to different kind of LT standards. We are trying to focus on things, and that's why we cooperate with both UTC, and TCCA, is really to focus it down to be a standard technology. We try to follow ITU and 3GPP. That's kind of essential, and the reason for that is really to get the smooth evolution of these technologies. Quite a lot of CDMA operators, when they evolve now from CDMA to LT, they don't even need to shift their equipment because they have software-defined radios that support CDMA, and that also, with a software upgrade on the radio part, can upgrade to LT. And we also, with this, can enhance more and more services. When we started the first LT network, we pretty much did broadband and VoIP, or voice over IP, some simpler access control. Then we start adding quality of service. We added narrowband IT services. We have added VoLTE or voice over LT, and we are now stepping in to also add quite a lot of the quality of service for mission critical services. And for private networks, it's still important to have all these features enabled, because you will have different functions that you would like to evolve. You can say that, I mean, why are we talking, I mean, there are a lot of technologies. We don't expect that everybody just moves out. Why do we talk 450? on this one, and why do we believe that this is a good ecosystem, and how do we want it to evolve? We have looked at a lot of spectrum. We actually working today from 380 to a little bit above 500 megahertz. And the reason for that is because we see that there are space, we see other technologies moving into mobile operations or to other types of technologies, which makes more and more space available. And we also believe that coexisting or evolvement of this and coexisting also with PMR and other systems are quite common. In most of the countries where you have 450 on LT, you also operate PMR, mesh networks, everything from M-bus networks to others in the same or in the different parts of the spectrum. It's not like everything from 450 to 470 or 410 to 430 becomes LT only. You have other technologies mixed in that band, mixed in these bands as well on more or less all countries we see. Well, and then maybe tie back, why do we focus on 450? I mean, there's a very good reason. Why do utilities focus on 450? I mean, going back a little bit to what Julian said here on Western Power Grid or Western Power Distribution, did a huge test. I think the latest tests, I took that one. These have been done, I would say, from different operators for the past 5-6 years, but I think this one is actually very, very visualized from WPD, where you see it's a free sector site and 2 single sector sites in the UK, where they have tried to cover, or they work, or they have 2,100 substations that they're covering within this area, and how many they covered with different spectrum, similar installation, same amount of infrastructure. That also goes approximately the same cost to install the 410 band to the 700 to 2.3 to the 3.8, and a little bit on how much you lose coverage wise. And it's all 450 is really about coverage, but you should also say it limits your capacity, because in the 450 you might get 5 + 5 megahertz. In the 700 you get a bit more. But if you're not requiring the capacity, especially not for substations and for utilities, and that's why we see the really, really good fit for utilities in this spectrum, is that this is approximately what is required for the nationwide coverage, for the wide area coverage in these networks. And it becomes a good network, affordable network, and probably the best in breed if you want to have a cost-efficient solution for utilities as it is today. Everything else will escalate, and it's not just the base station, it's the towers, it's the power backup, it's the transmission, it's all that comes with it that adds up in the cost structure when you build higher spec or higher with higher frequencies. Of course, I mean, even for us, we don't only work in 450. We work with quite a lot of different spectrum bands, and that's important because most of the operators that we see today have additional spectrum, and it might be or partner up with mobile operators as well. But I would say quite a lot of them have additional spectrum in the higher bands, and it will become more and more available with the industrial spectrums that are now available for local allocations. And we try to make sure that chipsets, infrastructure, and all parts of the ecosystem supports this in one solution. And that's also one of the drivers where we're looking at 3GPP and LTE, is that you can combine a lot of different networks and aggregate capacity. You can have them as fallback or different kind of settings, depending on what you require to build the functionality you need. And what we see when you evolve the networks, we usually see quite a lot of, especially industrial solutions, where you go from a 450, 410 network, and there are a lot of different ways of evolving your network. Some just go with 450, evolve it with IoT and mobile services on that. Other add private spectrum and go maybe with a +2 gigahertz band, and then evolve with 5G, really high spectrum for if they require that for certain services that they provide. We can also see other more mobile operators doing it for rural purposes, and also full full-scale mobile operations. So that's why you need to look at a wider ecosystem, and where we try to complement also to the end users how we build this for whatever service is required. The ecosystem, as we said, if we're looking at it, it is fairly small in comparison to the rest. I should say, to many other sub 1 gig bands. 450 is probably, or right now, the smallest one. But still, it is fairly well deployed in comparison to how many networks and how much infrastructure you need to build. And I think when we looked at it from the earlier parts here, we usually have one operator on 450 per country, or maybe two if you have both 450 and 410. But if you're looking at 700-800, it's usually 3 or 4 operators sharing or working within the same spectrum, which of course add the amount of networks and operators in the field. So the coverage area of what we cover with the spectrum is quite often larger globally and more harmonized than many of the other spectrums are. Device availability also, or availability, the first one was from GSA. This one is from what we've done ourselves. We do a global update on an annual basis on all things that are everything from antennas, chipsets, modules, devices in general, also base stations and so on, to maintain and see that we can say that we have a healthy infrastructure or healthy ecosystem for the operations that are live. And that's kind of one of our key targets within 450 Alliance is really to maintain an ecosystem and make sure that what are required by our members and our operators or other dedicated network operators, that we have the product they require. And we also have a fairly widespread. Not only do we have most or decent product range, we also have a decent supplier range. And I think that's something we also work quite a lot on, to make sure that most of the big suppliers are supporting this, that they are part of the ecosystem evolving it. They might not have hundreds of products for us, but we don't require hundreds of products. We require the right products, and we try to get them to complement each other. So most of the big players are part of this ecosystem, both on the network side, the chipset side, but also on the device side. And we see a big segment growing. From last year, we have double the amount of meters and I would say utility and water meters from the year before. So there are a growing interest with this. I would say also due to that, we have seen UTC and EUTC and others promoting this spectrum, being interested in it, and we have also tried to embrace that and push it on our end as much as we can to make sure that what is required for utilities are also available in this ecosystem. Hope I'm not driving too much on time, but I think I would like to just add one more thing, and that's in the 21st of September, we actually have our own event. So for you who want an extra deep dive into the 450 space, you are more than welcome to join us either on site in Düsseldorf or online. And with that, Collis, I hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gosta, for your excellent presentation. I do remember the radio conference, World Radio Conference of 2007. It was for the first time that the 400 megahertz band was first identified for IMT. I think that's a landmark. And at that time, I was working for the Inter-American Telecommunication Commission, CTEL, and we helped to move ahead a proposal to the conference for this identification. So it was a landmark. And now I can see a thriving industry and a lot of applications, and I congratulate 400 megahertz, 450 megahertz Alliance for the great work that you are advancing.
Thank you
for your participation. Thank you very much for your participation. Yeah. So Now, I'd like to turn to our next speaker. That's my dear friend, Julian Gomez Pineda from Tachyon Consultores, Colombia. Julian, my dear friend, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Clovis. Well, I hope that I'm having problems here to share my presentation.
Do you need any support from the Secretariat for doing that?
Yes, please. I don't have an
Marcio, let me ask Marcio.
Could please?
All right, it's available for you, Julian. Hit to share. Says compartilhar.
No, sorry, it's not working. And last time we had exactly the same problem. Is it possible that you put my presentation?
Yes,
please?
sure.
Thank you very much. It will be better.
Thank you, Marcio.
Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to participate. And first of all, I want to thank UTCAL for this invitation. A brief background regarding our company, Tachyon Consultores. We are a consultancy company, and we include in our practice spectrum management and public policy. We have been working in many countries in Latin America region. Next, please. I would like to share our recent experiences working for the Colombian electricity sector in the search for spectrum, which is work still in progress. Next, please. Let me first to provide you with some basic facts regarding the sector in the country. We have a medium market with around 15 million users. 92% of them are residential. The coverage of the service is good for Latin American standard with 97% of penetration of electricity in households. If you think by comparison, only 50% of the households in the country have fixed internet access. Other interesting aspect of this market is we have a mixture of companies. It includes important international players as Enel, but there are also several state-owned and private companies which has headquarters in Colombia but presence in many countries in Latin America. For example, Grupo Energía Bogotá with presence in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Guatemala, or EPM Group from Medellin that has presence in Colombia, Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, and Chile. The ISA Group, which is now controlled by Ecopetrol and with presence in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. And then we have Celsia, a private-owned company that works in Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, and Honduras. So that is important because several of the decisions are taken for the region for some of these companies from the country. Next, please. So next, please. Thank you. So let me give you a brief background of the work that I was doing for the Colombian electricity sector. I started working this in 2018, and then we had an update very recently in 2021. This work was sponsored by Colombia Inteligente, which is an initiative of several companies in order to provide smart grids. And the scope of the work include to understand what is the current usage of spectrum by the electricity sector in the country. which are the international trends in the use of spectrum, what could be the future usage of spectrum in the Colombian electricity sector, and then to understand and to provide some proposals regarding which could be the bands that will be more interesting and how to get access to that bands. Next, please. So the first thing that we found is not different to the different works made by the ITU and UTCAL, for example, have found in other countries in the region and in the world, and is that the spectrum is very important for mission critical process. In fact, in Colombia, spectrum is used for protection applications, for SCADA, for operational voice and data, for remote metering, for DDR, and the distribution network automation, and for video monitoring. So we have a wide scope of usage, of possible usage of spectrum. And in fact, this is being used at this moment. Next, please. And then we try to understand the strong relationship that is between the availability of spectrum for the electricity sector and the digitalization of the sector. In fact, there is an initiative called Smart Grid Colombia 2030 Vision. This is an initiative in order to start projects for AMI, ADA, DER, and DE. And in particular, in the AMA area, there is a strong support of the government in order to have 75% of the users that are in the national interconnection system using AMEs by 2030. This is at least 9 million of users that should be connected in that moment. But on the other side, a very recent law said that the energy service provider cannot transfer the cost associated with these smart meters to the users. So the companies need to fulfill the requirement of the government on time for 2030, but also they have the problem to make it with affordable cost for them. Next, please. So when we start to analyze the spectrum requirements of the electricity sector, we of course understood that most of the spectrum will be used for these AMI projects and ADA projects, but it has several requirements. It is needed good service quality levels, especially required for critical assets. It needs to have affordable cost, especially because the law, as I explained, don't let to transfer the cost to the users. And there are also strong security levels that that the smart grid needs to fulfill. So we identify a set of main challenges in the use of the spectrum. If we go to the unlicensed bands, we saw that there are possibilities of frequency saturation, and there are not protection against interference. When we try to see the possibility to the usage of third-party networks, for example, the mobile service provider networks, we learn that the quality levels is not accurate for several of the critical assets. And we also found that the incremental cost will be very difficult to handle, especially for this big AMI project. At the end, that we learn is that there is a need for a spectrum for license and also for unlicensed in order to use that for telemetry, telecontrol, or critical infrastructure, and it is needed in several bands where you cannot get that you need from the spectrum with only one band. Possibly you need VHF, UHF, and SHF bands. So next, please. Then the next question is, okay, there is a clear need, and how can we speak with the government in order to explain that this spectrum is needed, and this will be good for the economy and good for the country, and is also according with the law and with the spectrum management policies. In the specific case of Colombia, the spectrum allocation should seek to maximize social welfare and access and use of the radioelectric spectrum. And there is a very precise definition of what maximize social welfare means. In this case, this maximization should be understood as the reduction of the digital divide, universal access, the expansion of coverage, the deployment and use of networks and infrastructures, and improvement in the quality of the provision of services. So that we think is all of these objectives, one by one, are plenty fulfilled by these initiatives that look for a spectrum for the electricity sector. And on the other hand, when you look into the spectrum policy and what is the general objective of that policy in the country, which is stated in the policy, is that the spectrum has to be there in order to modernize the management of the radioelectric spectrum to support the digital transformation of the economy. And of course, the digitalization of the electricity sector will be a key component in this digital transformation of the economy. So we are being presenting these kind of arguments to the government, to the National Spectrum Agency, and to the National Planning Department in order to create that sense of need of spectrum for the electricity sector. Next, please. Then we try to understand which are the bands that are more needed, or the best possible bands for the country. And in that case, we need to establish a set of rules in order to identify that bands. For example, it is needed that the bands are requested for at least one of the actors, because there are not too much sense to propose bands that nobody wants. Then there is also the need to have a very good digital ecosystem and technological ecosystem in the band with several providers. And it's also needed, according to the needs of the country and the needs of the companies, to have licensed and unlicensed spectrum. According with that, three sets of objectives, we found that there are interests in the 169.4 band. There you have a technology called M-Bus wireless, and this band is of interest as redundancy mechanism for the implementation of PLC systems, and also in order to support functionality which are close to real time, such as last gasp. And in that case, we are following close what is happening in Europe, particularly in Italy and in Chile. Next, please. Then we have the 905, 915 megahertz band. This is part of the 902, 928 megahertz band, which is an ICM band, an unlicensed band for the Americas region. In Colombia, the situation of the band is particular because not all the band currently is for unlicensed usage, only from 915 to 928 megahertz. So our idea is that will be possible to use part of the band 905 to 915 megahertz in order to have the implementation of with using unlicensed spectrum, but only for utilities, the implementation of remote measurement systems, the AMI project, and for functionalities which are close to real time, such as ADA, telecontrol, and telemetry. And in this case, we are following close, which is happening in Brazil, United States, Puerto Rico, and Canada. And in the ecosystem, we have technologies as LoRa or WIS and Alliance. And third, the next one, please. And also very important, because until this time we only show unlicensed band, but we think, and the sector think, that there is also need for licensed band. In this case, we think that will be critical to get access to the 410, 430 megahertz, or, sorry for the Spanish, 450 or to 470 megahertz. My previous colleague make a very good presentation of the possibilities of the band. In fact, at the moment of the study, we found that these bands has been used by 6 countries for critical process in electricity sector, and we found 8 additional consultancy process in Europe, America, and in the Middle East. And for these bands, in the case of 450, 470, the band which is of interest in Colombia is the 3GPP 31, and for 410, 430, the bands of interest are 87 and 88. And in our opinion, and we think that the National Spectrum Agency is close to that opinion, is that the best alternative is the implementation of local private broadband mobile communication systems. However, there is a consultancy process and several studies currently being developed by the Spectrum Authority, and we think some definition about these bands will be seen during this year or the next one. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much, Clovis, and bye.
Thank you very much, Julian. Muchas gracias for your excellent presentation. I took notes of the excellent work the Colombian authorities are advancing in order to maximize the management of a spectrum for the electricity sector. It's a very good information. It's an example for the countries in the region. And I also commend our Colombian colleagues for the initiative Colombia Inteligente. I think that you are in the right way to delivering very good spectrum solutions in Colombia. And I would suggest that Colombia participates more effectively in CTEL and ITU fora, bringing this information to the world. I think that's very important that Colombia could share this information with the other countries. And I would encourage the Colombian regulator to consider this possibility. Thank you very much again, Julian. Now I'd like to turn to another dear friend for a long time, Mr. Celidonio from Futenal, from Nokia. I met Celidonio for the first time when I was working for the Brazilian government, regulatory agency, and he was working for the Argentinian government. And we had a very good time together in Foz do Iguaçu, at the margins of the big waterfall over there. Long time ago. We were younger, yeah, at that time. Go ahead. You have the floor, Celidonio.
Thank you very much, Clovis. I hope that you can see the presentation.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to UTCAL for the invitation to participate in this panel and bring our message on spectrum for utilities. You are right, Clovis. I mean, at that time, FutureCon was summit, so it was really far away in the time. And in my presentations, I'm gonna start presenting Nokia. Nokia is always very well known because of the phones, but in fact, the company that now I'm representing is focused on infrastructure, I mean, hardware, software for telecom networks. We have another company, HMD, who takes care of on the phones. And looking into, I mean, into this slide, you can see main information about our company. I would really focus on the investment we did in research and development in the last 2 decades, it was 129 billion euros. We are number 1 in 5G essential standard patents. We have the record in 5G in a commercial network in Finland with Elisa, working together with Qualcomm. We are also number 1 in telco software, and we are number 2 in global telecommunications infrastructures. But what is really very important for us, we were for the 5th time identified as one of the world's most ethical companies in the world, and in the last 4 years was in a row. So that we are really happy with this development and the behavior of our company. Well, it's not moving. Yep, no, but too fast. So for Latin America, we did a study together with Omdia. Omdia is a very well-known telecommunications consultant, together with Bell Labs, on the impact that 5G can have or will have in Latin America. And the result of the study is that from 2021 to 2035, the impact will be like 3,225 billion US dollars. And the main impact will start really in the region when we have more than 50% of presence in the different countries in Latin America. Productivity will increase, and also the GDP because of 5G. And the reason of that is not only because we have extreme mobile broadband, it's because of the economic sectors that will really benefit of 5G. And that is what you can see here below, how the impact is in the different sectors, in the ICT, in the manufacturing, the services, government, retail, agriculture, and others. So all these sectors will really take advantage of this technology in order to improve productivity, improve efficiency, and also improve security. I mean, security of the information, but also security of the people working in the companies. And because of that, Nokia focused on different areas regarding these economical sectors. First of all, in the energy, in the utilities, oil and gas and mining, in transportation with railways, ports, airports, in the public sector with public safety, defense, and also smart cities, education, broadband initiative, and also in the manufacturing sectors and supply chain. And we started several years ago working on all these sectors. So right now we have more than 350 private wireless customers in the world. So we are the market leader in private wireless in all the different sectors and also in the different regions of the world that you can see in this map. But also we are very strong in 5G. We have at this time 178 commercial 5G networks and 32 public enterprise 5G references. But I mean, so the sector is moving from 4G to 5G, but still there is a lot of work to be done. This is what you see as really a summary of 5G. We saw also in another presentations a similar triangle in which we have the extreme mobile broadband. What is that? What we are now seeing in 5G. But there are other two main developments in the extremes. That is, first of all, the critical machine communications, ultra low latency and reliable communications, and also the massive machine type of communication. So the effort here is to increase the capacity of the networks, make this more confidence and in order to be used for mission critical services. So in this kind of networks, the service cannot stop. The network has to run every day, every hour, every minute, and connecting everything, not only people, but things. But this is a long journey, and what we have right now is LTE, networks in LTE 4.9G, so close to 5G, in which operators and also enterprises, and in this case utilities, can take and are taking advantage of this technology in order to connect everything, because it has the capacity the technology offers that the company can take advantage of. Also, reliable machine communications, and also the possibility to connect everything, the narrowband IoT and the LTE-M. So today, companies taking advantage of this are preparing their way in order to move in the future smoothly to 5G. This is the roadmap of 5G. But here you can see the way in which all this triangle will be improved year by year through the different releases that the 3GPP is working on. But right now, I mean, the 4G LTE networks are taking advantage or are having almost all the elements of the release 15 and release 16. But what is very more important in 5G, and something that we have to take into account, is that in the release 18, in the full massive IoT, we will have narrowband 5G NR. So the possibility to use 3 megahertz, 5 megahertz of the band in order to connect everything. And the expectation is to have this in 2023. So it's still a long time to work, and we have to start deploying and using, in this case, LTE. And now I will focus on the spectrum. The spectrum is key. I mean, the spectrum is like the highways in which all the information flows, the information, data, videos, and so on. So we need this kind of highway in order to communicate. If we do not have spectrum, it's going to be almost impossible to have any kind of network. But when we talk about spectrum, we have different kind of level or conditions of the different frequency bands. We have the low bands. I mean, the low bands from 410 to 2100 megahertz. These are ideal for coverage. We have here in the other presentation about the good performance we have on coverage in 410, 430, or 450, 407. That is the main characteristic of the low band. So we need low bands in order to have coverage, in order to have also a deep indoor service. Then we have the mid bands. I mean, the mid bands are very important because of the capacity. When we talk about mid bands, we are talking about from 2 to 3 gigahertz to 7.2 gigahertz frequency. In this case, depending on the situation, operators or enterprises, they need to have like 60, 80, or 100 megahertz continuous spectrum in order to take advantage of the capacity that offer this kind of frequency bands. And then we have the high bands. The high bands are more like hotspots, ultra broadband, with a lot of capacity, and of course, more challenge regarding the coverage. So when we talk about enterprises, when we talk about utilities, I mean, the main focus is to think about spectrum in low bands and mid bands. And here you will see all the different frequency bands that we present to the different governments in Latin America. The idea in the case of Latin America is a challenge, and I will tell you why. I mean, the aim is to identify 3GPP spectrum spectrum in which we have a 3GPP standard and a 3GPP ecosystem that is very, very important in order to make everything work smoothly. On the other side, of course, we have in the Americas a lot of different frequencies that are being used by operators. But there are other frequencies in which the operators are not present, but in which we have ecosystem because these kind of frequencies are being used in other parts of the world, also by operators or other users. And this is the kind of frequencies that we are showing here. First of all, and the most important for utilities is for 10, for 30, for 50, for 70 megahertz because of the coverage. And we had a very good presentation from the 450 Alliance on this regard. Also, the 3GPP is working on the frequency from 380 to 400 megahertz. This is going to be also very important frequency in the future to be identified for utilities and verticals in Latin America. The second band is the L band. And in the L band, we are talking about the band 50 of the 3GPP. This L band gives us also coverage and also brings more capacity that can be used for our networks. Then we have 2.3 gigahertz. This is another very important band that we see, for example, in Brazil, being identified for part of the band for verticals. Chile is also using it, and other countries are starting to analyze it. It's a frequency in which we have an ecosystem, but operators are not really interested on this band. Then we have also the portion of TDD portion of the 2.6 gigahertz band, I mean the band 38 in the 3GPP. This 40, 50 megahertz also can be used for verticals, for utilities. And again, it's a frequency that is in the middle of an FDD arrangement. In this case, we have in the FDD arrangement operators offering services, but really nobody's focusing on this portion of the TDD frequency, so something that can be used by utilities on verticals. The other frequency that we think is very important is 3.7 to 3.8 gigahertz, and exclusively and dedicated for verticals. And when I'm talking about verticals, also can be used by utilities. This is really capacity, it's less than coverage, but more capacity. And it's a frequency that makes sense to be used by this kind of users instead of giving this spectrum for operators, because they are also in the border of the C-band satellite services. So in some way, a national coverage using this band cannot work, but located specific areas to be covered with this frequency can work very well. And then finally, I would say that is maybe not for utilities, but for verticals, to think about using part of the 26 and 28 gigahertz band for verticals, not only for operators, but also for verticals, for enterprises, because again, I mean, the frequency, the coverage is not the main characteristic. The main characteristic is capacity, huge capacity. So if there is a need of capacity, enterprises can also take advantage of this frequency. So here you have like a summary of all the utility sector. I mean, we have the generation, the transmission, and distribution of energy or water. And that was also presented by UTC. But what you can see in this slide is in the different sectors of this ecosystem, there are activities that can be supported more productive and more efficient if we use telecommunications, if we use private wireless, if we use, I mean, the technology we need in order to connect everything and offer these kind of services. Examples you will see here in the case of Western Power Distribution, we have an LT 410 megahertz network that is being used for smart grid, for SCADA, voice, video, and data services. So it's really one, for example, of the solutions that Nokia is offering. We have also, in the case of Poland, PGE system, in this case, using the 450 megahertz. The first one was 410, this kind is 450, also for this different kind of services. And finally, we have also, in the case of Brazil, Espectro, in this case, using 3.5 gigahertz, more capacity than coverage, in order to support, the service of Espectro. As a conclusion, we have that the digitalization of enterprises is key. All the world and all our countries and societies are moving to digitalization. The digital transformation is the way of the future. And in this digitalization of enterprises, private wireless solution plays a very important role. And within this, of course, we need to have harmonized spectrum. It starts all this process with LTE, and then will smoothly improve in 5G using mission critical networks. So in order to do this movement, what we need is, first of all, to identify spectrum, and the spectrum should be 3GPP spectrum, dedicated spectrum for utilities, dedicated spectrum for verticals, but also what we need is the regulatory framework that allows the use of these kind of spectrums. I'm starting to have a lot of conversation with different governments in the region, and depending on the countries, they do not have not only a dedicated spectrum for utilities or verticals, they also don't have the regulatory framework in order to support us. So it's something that we have to start working from scratch. It's a process, a long process in which we have to work with the regulators. The key frequencies, in bold, you will see all that we think are key for utilities in 410, 430, 450, 470, 1.5 gigahertz, and 3.7 to 3.8. But the idea is to push in all these efforts, all the different frequency band that can be used for enterprises, utilities, or verticals. And the work is, and I found very good the presentation of UTC. We have to work at local level, at national level with governments. We have to work at regional level in the case of the Americas with CITEL. And we have also worked at international level within the ITU. In all these three areas, we have to be very active. What is our challenge? Our challenge is that utilities for governments, for the telecom regulators, is something new. They are used to work with operators. In the last 30, 40 years, they were working a lot with them from the radio communications perspective. Utilities is something new. So we have to evangelize governments and the people in order to start thinking how to approach better utilities and enterprises in order to support them in their journey to the digitalizations. And to finalize, here you have, our message as Nokia. At Nokia, we create technology that helps the world act together. And we have to act together in order to move forward and be able to identify, harmonize, dedicated spectrum for utilities and verticals, and also the regulatory framework we need. So that's all, Chloe. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much, Celedonio, for your excellent presentation. And I just would like to share your views in your final words. We need to evangelize governments. It's very important to have in place a regulatory framework that would enable utility companies to source equipment benefiting from economies of scale due to spectrum harmonization. And I also took notes of the wide range of options in terms of spectrum for verticals that Nokia is recommending, and I do appreciate this contribution from Nokia to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
I would like to thank you, Celedonio. I'd like to turn now to our last speaker, Mr. John Yaldwin from 4RF. John, you have the floor.
Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. I'm the last speaker. Thank you, Clovis. I will just share my PowerPoint so that you can see. Right, I hope that's coming through okay. So this panel is focused very much on a summary of international efforts to find spectrum for utilities. And in my discussion today, I want to touch on various initiatives that have occurred around the world and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the various pieces of spectrum that have been identified, and talk also about some opportunities perhaps. The last point that I'll be making is to discuss what utilities need to do. There is a great deal of work here, and I feel that utilities need to take a larger burden of this work on board. Now, why should 4RF be talking about spectrum? Well, we operate in 150 countries around the world. We're active in LTE and we're active in private narrowband radio systems that are used for SCADA. So we have a great deal of experience with different regulatory regimes, ranging from traditional land mobile radio through to allocations for LTE. And I'd like to share some of that in the discussion today. The first thing to understand, and I think it's very critical because I often find sometimes utilities and people in utilities are not realistic about spectrum. They have sometimes an attitude, and I think we must be honest here about our own views. Sometimes we have an attitude in the industry that, well, it should be obvious that utilities need spectrum. It should be obvious that spectrum is required to keep the lights on. But that's not the view of regulators. Regulators are charged by their governments to make money from spectrum. So we have, on one hand, the utility mission critical networks used by utilities, water, electricity, gas. And on the other hand, we have what I call the golden rule, which is that any spectrum that is useful for LTE or 5G will be sold to the highest bidder. And utilities can't afford to be the highest bidder. The industry does not have the sort of money to invest and compete with commercial carriers, commercial cellular operators. And it seems amazing to me, but it's a reality, that regulators seem to be unable to balance their revenue expectations set by government with public good. And there are so many examples of this. The key question here is, how do we align the needs of mission critical networks with the requirements set by government to regulators to sell spectrum for the highest bidder? And that requires political pressure to be applied to governments, and that pressure can only come from utilities because no one is going to do it for them. And I'll give you just one example. Recently in the WPD seminar that's been mentioned by various other panel members, policy manager from Ofcom stated, can the issues regarding commercial delivery of communications be sufficiently mitigated? There is no easily available spectrum, so what action would need to be taken? Now the subtext, what he was really saying is, utilities, you should use the commercial carriers. Well, what's wrong with commercial carriers? They can solve every problem. So, it's not a regulatory issue. We wash our hands. It is over to you to negotiate with the common carriers. And of course, those of us in the utility industry or have been assisting with utility industry efforts know that this is not a practical solution, because the utility carriers, their investment and backup their investment in reliability, their investment in priorities are all aligned to consumers. They're all aligned to downloading videos on smartphones. They're not aligned to provide service during flooding. They're not aligned to provide service during chaotic weather events, because that costs too much money and their return on their investment would be reduced if they had to build such a robust system. And of course, there are issues to do with latency. So the idea of utilities sharing commercial networks for their most critical communications is really not a good idea. And I think that utilities know that, but it surprises me again and again that this message has not been received by regulators. And we have to ask ourselves as an industry, why is that? Why have we not been able to convince regulators and their governments that mission critical networks for utilities are of national importance? We'll talk a little bit about spectrum, because I believe sometimes regulators can be a little short-sighted when they consider spectrum options for utilities. Let's see if we can remind them of some options. Before we do that, let's have a wee look at the evolution of cellular. Where have we come from? Well, as you know, systems started in the early days with analog 1G and then later 2G GSM-based systems, and we've migrated from there to data services being supported by GPRS, CDMA 3G, 4G, and now we have the promise of 5G coming up. So there is this continuous evolution of technology that we need to be aware of. And it's very tempting to say, oh, we should stand still and wait for the next new technology to arrive because that will solve all our problems. But there is a risk of complacency if we do that, because what will happen is that by the time the new technology has arrived, there will be no spectrum left to deploy it. So private and public LTE is very tempting for capacity and cost perspectives for utilities, but planning is essential. We need 3GPP standardized spectrum, and we need certified devices. 4RF, for example, is a member of the Global Certification Forum, which means that our devices are certified to meet global requirements. This kind of standardization in equipment and in spectrum access is absolutely critical. When we look at LTE more specifically now for utility deployment, we see that most utility networks rapidly become, if they're not so at inception, multi-application networks. That is, networks that are required to support a range of applications, often metering, security, video, but more particularly DA, distribution automation, and distributed renewable automation projects. So these multiple applications often put quite a bit of pressure on uplink capability, but fortunately with standards such as the new Cat7 and for lower capacity systems, Cat12, Cat20 for high capacity systems, there is now the ability to increase the upload, because all cellular standards are designed about content delivery. In other words, the highest capacity is in the downlink, because the usual use of these systems is for cell phones, where we want to download capacity to the cell phone. But the utility industry is quite different. In the utility industry, the direction of traffic is in the opposite direction. It is flowing up to a core network. So we need more capacity in uplink bands. And this kind of shows a natural bias in the 3GPP standardization effort towards commercial carriers rather than the utility industry. Something to be very aware of when considering multi-application networks. Let's look next at the spectrum and putting it in context. So in the discussion today, there've been quite a bit of discussion about the UHF bands at 300 to 400 megahertz. There's been some discussion about migrating perhaps Tetra systems to make that spectrum available for LTE. There's no current 3GPP band assignment yet for Tetra, but we hope that that may happen. We have low band spectrum in the 600, 700 and 900 megahertz range. 600 megahertz are very popular in North America with both Canada and the United States, having quite large quantity of 600 megahertz spectrum available. In Europe, there is the equivalent of band 12 for public safety communications, FirstNet band 14 in the United States, very similar sort of application and similar frequency range. There is a private initiative in the United States to free up spectrum for utilities. Anterix 900 megs, we'll look a little bit about that later. And there, of course, the mid-band C-band spectrum at 3.6 gigahertz, the FCC's so-called Citizens Band Radio Service, which provides some very useful high-capacity spectrum. And we'll look at those three shortly. Let's look first at 450 megahertz, and I won't spend too much time on this because the excellent presentation by the 450 Meg Alliance drew attention to the work here. But I will say that there are some limitations here with the UHF band options. The first problem is that there are so many. So when we talk about harmonized allocations, I think perhaps it would be better to call them standardized rather than harmonized, because there are already 5 different bands, and with Tetra there'll be 6. And these bands are in different parts of the UHF spectrum. And they have some limitations in terms of bandwidth. Presently, the minimum bandwidth for 5G is 5 megahertz, and many of the allocations we've seen will not support a 5G carrier if that is your ambition. Yes, I know in future perhaps the technology development will allow 5G deployment, standardized 5G deployment in lower capacity channels, but we're not here yet. So our goal with the spectrum must be for 4G and for narrowband IoT. The key thing here is that there is spectrum. However, at UHF, you have issues in continents such as South America and Europe with transnational propagation and interference potential that really needs to be considered. Second point is that antennas are quite large in this range, and there's little alignment by ITU region. So when we move from region 1 to region 2 or perhaps to region 3, there are different competing demands for these bands, although there is quite a lot of interest around the key 450 bands of band 31, 72 and 73, but equally there's a large group looking at the lower 410 meg bands. So yes, there are great options at 400 megahertz. I don't want to seem too negative, but we need more. 400 megahertz is not enough. 400 megahertz is the waypoint to a destination. It is not the destination, it's a stop along the way. We need more. Let's look at some unexplored options. And this is really the thrust of my talk here today, is you need to talk to regulators about opportunities that are currently being enjoyed by other users. There are bands in between the uplink and downlink bands of duplex allocations. We start off with an example here of 700 megahertz in the United States. Was guard band spectrum unused. It was reassigned so that utilities could use it for narrowband radio systems. 4RF played a key part in making that a successful opportunity for utilities. So this is an example of repurposed guard bands. 1 meg is a little bit too small for LTE, but guard bands, for example, at 600 megahertz, band 71 are 3 megahertz wide, so there's an immediate opportunity to reuse the guard band spectrum. And there's the duplex mid-band gap. In the case of 600 megahertz, it's 11 megahertz wide, so there's a useful opportunity there. And there are other mid-band gaps. There's one in band 28, which has already been standardized by 3GPP as band 67, used in Switzerland. There's a duplex band 20 gap at 812 to 832. And a note here is that I see that program making and special event sector has a large amount of spectrum. You know, they have, well, for example, in Brazil, more than 200 megahertz assigned for radio microphones. Is that the best use of the spectrum? Why does the entertainment industry have such large resources? This is a key question we need to ask ourselves. Why is it that the political power of the television industry such that utilities are missing out? This is, I think, a pretty key question. I'll give you one example of repurposing spectrum. Ofcom back in 2007 took the band 3 duplex gap between 1785 and 1805 and auctioned it off. Now, of course, to avoid interference with the primary band 3 user, there has to be suitable masks, etc. But it's still very useful spectrum. And all the way through the present band assignments, these duplex gaps, these guard bands, are being used by news gathering, by television outside broadcast, and program making special events. And in Brazil, for example, as I said earlier, there's a large amount of spectrum, not including unlicensed, which is being used for these events. And my question is are utilities doing enough to articulate their spectrum needs when the entertainment industry seems to be doing quite well in terms of spectrum? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. Let's look at a couple of opportunities from the United States. The United States CBRS program at 3.6 gigahertz, I think, was a real success. It showed a method of sharing spectrum between incumbent users. In the case of the US, it was the Navy and commercial satellite downlinks, utility broadband wireless access legacy assignments, new priority users, and a class of general users. So rather than blocking off separate parts of the spectrum for each user, a mechanism was invented that allowed the same spectrum to be used by different users through a spectrum access system mechanism. And I think it's a very clever idea. And even though each country will have a different set of priorities for spectrum like this, the idea of using a spectrum access system to coordinate access to different parts of the band dynamically is a really good idea and well worth examination. Another example of private enterprise coming up with an idea is the Anterix 900 megahertz band 8 spectrum. So this was spectrum that was used for land mobile radio. The Anterix company managed to acquire sufficient licenses, and then it proposed to the FCC regulator that the licenses be reorganized to free up a chunk of spectrum 3 megahertz wide in the uplink and downlink bands to allow for utility access. Now, of course, it comes at a price, but that is the private enterprise way in the United States, as we know. But still, this was a great idea, a great spectrum initiative that is offering opportunities to American utilities for low band spectrum of quite great value. There are some issues, of course, with use of devices in this kind of spectrum. The FCC have very specific rules, but one huge advantage of using land mobile radio spectrum for cellular is that it allows quite high power. So devices with 10 watt capability rather than the more traditional low power cellular capability is possible when land mobile spectrum is reassigned. There are some issues with the Anterix initiative in the US. We should acknowledge the transmit-receive split is not equal to the 3GPP standard, but there is a workaround for this, that many chipsets support what's called networked assigned duplex, which allows for a more flexible transmit-receive split than fixed alignment with the 3GPP band. I want to talk, before I finish, about the 600 megahertz band. This is a very powerful band. It has great availability. The FCC rightly limited the amount of 600 megahertz spectrum that could be acquired by commercial cellular operators. It was previously television spectrum, but of course, most entertainment television systems in most parts of the world has migrated to television receive-only satellite-based distribution. And so I think this is a good example of repurposing television spectrum into 7 5 meg blocks. There's good availability in the United States, and I would imagine that a similar initiative should be possible in Latin America. Again, this band is going to be probably primarily used for commercial cellular, but a wise government would ask the regulator to reserve some blocks in the spectrum for utility use. But failing that, there is still the duplex gap and the guard band spectrum surrounding it that may well be able to be repurposed. And finally, what I really want to touch on, and in fact, if none of my technical arguments have swayed you, the key points here is that there's always going to be competition for spectrum. Remember the golden rule: if there can be money made out of spectrum by selling it to a cellular company, then that is what the regulator will do, unless the government tells them not to. And so it really is critical that you articulate the key values of mission critical utility operation. You have to ask the government, do they want entertainment or do they want electricity? Do they want people playing games or do they want gas delivery to heat homes? Do they want people playing with WhatsApp on their phone or do they want water, drinking water, delivered to homes? What are society's real priorities? That's the message that utilities must deliver to government. If the regulator won't listen, go direct to your government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your excellent presentation. And now I would like to turn into the questions and answers session. And I'd like to ask you, John, my first question. I was really impressed with the unexplored options that you presented to us. And I fell in doubt. How about the question for harmonizing spectrum for utilities at the regional and global levels? If you have a fragmentation of allocations, how could you achieve economies of scale due to the harmonization of spectrum in various countries and regions?
Well, it's a good question. The reality is that there are, I think there's 50 or 60 3GPP standardized bands at least. I know the band numbering goes to 80 odd, but in reality there's probably 50 or 60 bands. We have to accept that there are these ITU regional differences, ITU region 1, 2, and 3. They have traditional backgrounds and legacy allocations that are sometimes difficult to move. We have to live with that environment. What we need is the flexibility, and luckily technology comes to the rescue, that many of the chipsets available today for LTE allow for a very dynamic allocation of bands. It's quite common with the more advanced user equipment, CPE equipment today, to have perhaps 15 or 20 frequency bands within one device. However, there are still constraints with antennas that we need to deal with. But look, I think the fractured band allocations are just a reality that utilities and the CPE, UE manufacturers and the infrastructure companies need to face up to. I don't see a global harmonized band for utilities being possible.
Thank you very much. I think that your observation is very interesting and should be properly considered by UTCAL, Euro UTC, and other trade organizations dealing with spectrum for utilities. I would like now to ask the speakers to turn on their videos. We have some other questions to the panel, please. Okay, everybody on. Okay, thank you very much. So I have a question that came from the audience, a little bit provocative, and I'd like to present it to the panel. I'd like to hear from you. The question is, how are LTE results in 250 megahertz spectrum for utilities? I'd like to add that in Brazil, this band has been band 230, 280 megahertz, has been allocated by the regulator to applications like private networks. And there is already deployments, there are some deployments of LTE-like networks. It's not a band standardized by 3GPP. But there are some companies that are deploying networks for railways, for mining companies, and there are some utility companies that are interested in sourcing equipments that operates in this band. And I'd like to hear from the panel, all of you, what is your perception? Would be your comments on the use of these bands for LTE-like systems? Do you have any information on that? Any experience you might have heard about?
So I could make the first quick comment on that. The main issue I see here is that the band, there is no 3GPP standardized band at 200 megahertz. And already we're seeing some proprietary systems being deployed. One manufacturer has taken the LTE standard and made various changes to carrier spacing, etc., which has ended up in a completely proprietary system. Another manufacturer has taken 3GPP release 14 equipment and down-banded it into the spectrum, made it operate at the lower end. Both are valid, but I do question the first approach. The most important thing, though, is that if there's going to be allocation of non-standard spectrum, that very early approach is made to 3GPP, ETSI, to get the band standardized, because most manufacturers be reluctant to tool up for a one-off band in one country.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments?
Maybe I can add to that, because we looked at it since it's a lower band and we are quite active in the lower bands. We could not, we have only seen kind of availability in Brazil. And I think we have contacted about 120 regulators, because we do that on a regular basis, and there have not really been availability. So we kind of said it might be a one-off if that's something that suits John Deere or somebody to do something specific for Brazil, maybe it, but I think it's hard for us to drive through a 3GPP structure at this point. At least it needs to evolve quite a lot, and at this stage it was quite hard.
Yes, I see it. Thank you very much, Gostan. Any other comments on that? Celedonio, yes. Please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I agree with John. I mean, it has to be 3GPP compliance. I mean, it should be 3GPP. It makes no sense to have something proprietary. The operator or the company or whatever will be like in the hands of only one vendor, and there will be no future-proof evolution of that technology. So it really makes a lot of sense to focus on 3GPP standardized bands with ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. Very good discussion on that. So I said at the very start it was a provocative question. Any other comments on that? Otherwise, I have a lot of questions.
I think just to echo what the other guys have said, you know, the problem with that 230 to 250 is it's not available in most of the world. Certainly here in the Europe it's used for digital audio broadcasting. And I think anyone buying into a technology that claims to be LTE-like but isn't actually standardized should ask themselves the question, well, why is this company trying to sell me this stuff, if not at least partially to have some, you know, vendor lock-in? And that's something that utilities have historically had their fingers burned with, and we don't want to go down that route again, I guess. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think, as Jostja said, maybe it's got some specific applications, but I would definitely exercise caution before going down that route. So.
Well, thank you very much. Very good comments. And I'm pretty much sure that the utilities, the associates of UTCAL would benefit a lot from these visions. Any other comments? Okay, so I'll jump to the next question. Let me see here. Okay, another question I'd like to throw to the panel. How can utilities support the effort for international harmonized spectrum? Perhaps Brett could please provide an answer to this question.
Sure, and thanks for the question, Clovis. So, yeah, I think it goes back to the comment that was made earlier about evangelizing. So utilities, in my experience, have operated independently. They're used to basically purchasing commercial off-the-shelf equipment. And that's worked because they've been targeting specific applications to for these communication systems. But, from a cost-effective standpoint, it's going to be really difficult to make that model work in the future when it comes to LTE. You need to have concerted effort, where utilities are getting together and developing solutions, not just relying, upon themselves to come up with an answer. And they would need to work with their technology providers. They need to work with government. The folks in government, like, the previous comment that was made, is true. I mean, they're used to basically working with commercial operators. They're not used to working with utilities. Unless the utilities show up, they're not going to, be making a priority to try and provide access in some of these bands that we're talking about. And then the final point I'll make is, as utilities approach policymakers to try and get access to spectrum, it's very important for them to try and make the connection between some of these policies that the policymakers are supporting, like clean energy, and the communication networks that enable them. And quite frankly, that's true, I think, wherever you go. But, in the United States particularly, there's very little understanding between the connection between these communication systems and some of these clean energy policies that they're trying to implement. You can't, achieve a lot of what they're trying to accomplish without having a communication system in the background. So it's very much, getting back to the point of, commercial auctioning of the spectrum, it's very much a hidden cost. And I think, in addition to us talking about the benefits that would go along with, utilities being able to get access to the spectrum, we need to look at this from a cost standpoint. All these things that we're seeing right now, when Hurricane Ida is ravaging through the United States as we speak, the fact that, utilities now are behind in terms of being able to get access to the kind of spectrum that the commercial carriers are not, is putting them at a disadvantage. And that's going to result in real cost to consumers when it comes to these power outages and being able to restore power. Thus far, utilities have been able to keep their heads above water. And I will say, quite frankly, our experience has been in post-Ida that our systems have remained operational. Commercial systems have not. The outage percentages in Louisiana, where the Hurricane Ida made landfall, were at 50% at the start, and now they're like 30% outages even today. So, utilities can't afford to have that kind of vulnerability if they were to rely on commercial operations for those kind of services. So, when you look at this from any number of different perspectives, it's really important for us to evangelize and work collaboratively with each other to come up with solutions rather than to sit back and expect somebody to do our work for us. So that's my message to the utilities.
Thank you, Brett. Yes, I think that one of the strongest messages from this panel is that we'll have a lot of work to do with regulators at national, regional, and international level. So
maybe I would like to add one thing on this with the spectrum and so on. I think also you should not only look at spectrum harmonization. The important thing is that you actually get an ecosystem harmonization. There are many chipset that supports multiple spectrum that can be integrated into the same devices in an efficient and cost-efficient way. And I think that's equally important, and that's what you should benefit from, that you actually select a number of spectrum. And I think the moment right now with private spectrums in LTE and 5G being more available and more general available globally, hopefully will drive a number of spectrum. So, I mean, I think most devices today supports a significant amount of bands, and there's no reason that the additional cost per band and the antenna system integrated are quite efficient and good today. But I'm coming from the operator side, so of course I might have a simplistic view on this from that end compared to what you guys see. But I mean, I think it's the approach to take to get somewhere a little bit, and you get a quicker time to market in that.
Yes, Gus, I think that is a very important observation. We have options. Technology bring options. For example, software-defined radios and chips that can operate in multiple frequency bands. This is very important. This is why such kind of events are so important for UTCAL and its associates. I think that there is a tremendous need for information, and you are providing very, very important material for our future discussions within UTCAL. I think that is another comment.
Yeah, so Clovis, this is something that we recognised over the past 12 to 18 months within EUTC, that we have held many events over a number of years where we all agree what we need to do. And I think as John Yalgren commented earlier, some of the information and feedback from Ofcom in the UK is, okay, we kind of agree that this isn't ideal, but we can't make spectrum available, but it needs politicians to tell us what to do. And so, although this takes us out of our comfort zone, generally as technical and engineering people, we have to look ourselves in the mirror or look each other in the eye and say, who's going to do this if not us? So we need the outreach, be that to politicians in Brazil, in the US, to MEPs here in Europe, because if we don't do that, we won't get the traction that we need. And you could also say, why is it that broadcasters and mobile operators have such clout and such influence? And it's because they have invested that time at the political level and financially. And I should also say one piece of work taking place here in Europe is, okay, what's the cost if we don't get access to spectrum, if we don't have a smart grid? And the cost is huge, because you say the only way to continue to have a reliable energy network in the decarbonised future is to use a brute force method to double or triple the size of the energy grid. And the cost of that is absolutely astronomical. But these are the kinds of papers and documents and numbers that you need when you're presenting to politicians, because that's what they understand, and that's where they'll make their decisions. So maybe it's not about revenue generation from spectrum, but it's about the cost avoidance of having the smart grid. And unfortunately, so many government initiatives about smart grids go straight to the end point about talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data analytics, but no one wants to talk about the dirty and awkward part about how do we get the data from where it is to where it needs to be reliably. And that's where we really collectively have to up our game. And I think that's, events like this are part of that process, I guess.
Yes, Julian, indeed. But taking into account the comment from the Ofcom's spectrum policy leader, I understood that it's tremendously difficult in the UK to identify a small chunk, at least a small chunk of spectrum to be allocated for utilities. How this can be worked in the UK? Which kind of solution do you envisage in the UK?
I could jump in, Julian, because I have pretty strong views on Ofcom, and it might be
fire away, John.
safer if I say them than if you say them.
Very good debate, yeah.
Because you have to live there. The key thing that Ofcom came across saying was, why don't utilities use the commercial cellular carriers? Maybe there's an MVNO model or something that will work. But for the points that Brett commented on, that commercial cellular networks just are not built to the sort of standards that utilities need, and we know that, and we need to inform the regulators. Second point is that my view is that regulators like Ofcom, and I'm trying not to pick on them, but I'm really going to pick on them, is that they're quite blinkered. They only look at identified bands. They don't think outside the square. The only example I can find of Ofcom really thinking outside the square was their allocation of the mid-band gap in band 3. That was a good example where they took that 15 megahertz of spectrum and made it available. I think they could do more like that. There's more work. Now, people will say, oh, but we've already allowed the program making people to get in there. And yes, that's true, but maybe that needs to be shared. Maybe if we can have some UHF spectrum, if we could have some 1.4 gig spectrum, and then if they get interference from a radio microphone, we switch over to 1.4. And if there's no interference from the radio microphone in the middle of nowhere, because program making does not occur over the whole of the UK 24/7. I'm sure there's plenty of places in even a high density country like the UK where there's no operation of radio mics, and the UHF spectrum, as we know from the presentation from 450 Connect, is very powerful for that long distance capability. Then the systems can operate. So there has to be sharing initiatives. We need to look at where PMSE in particular, because they do have a huge amount of spectrum. When I prepared for this talk, I picked specifically on Brazil and identified 200 megs of spectrum set aside for PMSE. If I go to the United Kingdom, I can tell you that there's several times that. There is in the order of 400 megahertz of dedicated PMSE spectrum, which is only being used part-time. And Ofcom, you should be talking to them about that and saying, we're not trying to displace PMSE, but we want to share it co-equally.
John, talking about this 200 megahertz band allocated to PMSE in Brazil, which frequency which frequency bands is this?
There are many frequency bands. It starts it starts at 70 megahertz and goes up to 900 megahertz. You'll be quite surprised, but on the Anatel website there is a list of spectrum allocated to PMSE. I can't get it for you immediately, but I will drop you an email with a list. I think you'll be surprised just how much there is. And we are talking below 900 megs here, so it is golden spectrum for LTE, utility LTE.
Oh, thank you very much for raising this point. UTCAL will have a mechanism for a dialogue with Anatel, a permanent dialogue, and this is a very good information for us to start discussing with them. Okay, I appreciate that. Any other comments on this particular?
If I can.
Celedonio, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Clovis. I mean, as regulators, they are a challenge, as it was been said. I mean, they see spectrum linked to a special service, band linked to a special service, and then to try to modify this is not very easy. And the challenge we are seeing with utilities is in the way you are trying to focus on low frequency bands. Low frequency bands are a mess. I mean, I can say that starting from 800 above, always is very well organized. But in the past, all new services came in the low frequency bands. And it came a company to the regulator and say, I have this solution. So they received the opportunity to use it. So right now, in order to use low frequency bands with 3GPP, we have to work very hard in cleaning that spectrum. That is one of the main challenges. And usually regulators, at least in Latin America, they do not know really who are using what, because they have a lot of records, but they are almost outdated. So they have to, it's like archaeology. They have to start looking in everything in order to try to clean that spectrum. And about the comment of a global harmonization for utilities, I think this should be the aim. Of course, it's going to be very difficult, but in working this, you bring the topic to all the governments worldwide. But key is to have harmonization in the region because of the cross-border interference. So in the way you move, almost all governments in a region, smaller account of countries, identifying a similar or the same frequency band for a specific service, this will make it more easier for all the governments to coordinate and looking into them. I mean, as a government sees that another government is moving that way, and then another one, they will start to think from a regional point of view. And that is, I think, the way we will be able to have something for utilities, to have only the local government looking for a local solution for one company makes no sense.
Yes, I do agree with you. I'd like to address another question. In terms of spectrum sharing, what are your views on spectrum sharing? Sharing of spectrum allocated to utilities with other applications, or do you understand that allocation of spectrum for utilities should be on a primary basis, or could it be on a secondary basis? We'd like to hear from our experts on these questions. Any candidates?
Clovis, from my point of view,
Yeah.
if you want to have a mission critical network, it has to be premier. You have
Okay.
to be really protected. If not, I mean, if somebody else can go in that frequency and start using it for other services, you will have a problem. So sharing in a way that nobody else is using that frequency in that area. But if not, I mean, to have a mission critical network, sharing the frequency with other users sounds a bit strange.
If I could perhaps comment on some technical aspects here, though, the reality is that pretty much all spectrum is shared. If we look at the 450 megahertz spectrum, you know, the propagation on that band allows for transnational propagation. You may have an allocation in Europe, for example, and have interference from the UK. You may have an allocation in Ireland and receive interference from the Mediterranean. So you must design your networks with the potential for interference in mind. I agree with the Nokia representative that the goal should be a primary user in this band, but that is not the reality today. And some administrations like the FCC with CBRS have recognized this and put in a formal means to allow tiered access. But the equipment that we deploy for our networks can also do this. We can have the equipment switch automatically between UHF and a higher frequency band at, say, 700 megahertz. The key thing, though, is that the utility must have access to more than one frequency band to allow for this automatic switching, backup, prioritization of traffic. If you have low capacity traffic, you can use a narrowband LTE or narrowband IoT allocation. If you have high capacity traffic, you can use wider band channels. But you really need to have allocations in more than one band so that if you get interference, intermodulation, overload, unusual propagation conditions in one frequency band, that you have another frequency band available to you within the same device. The module within the LTE device can often support the 450, can support 700 megs, can support 1.4 gigs. If it has the ability to switch across between these, then you can protect yourself from interference. It's very difficult to find frequency bands in most nations that are exclusive. And in Latin America, you know, you don't have the same frequency bands across the whole of the continent. And yet, you know, operation in that band in a different country could well propagate into your country and cause interference. So you must have the technical ability to switch bands dynamically.
Yes,
maybe respond a little bit to these ones, because I think it's, for me, this is a normal issue. This is a non-issue. Operators has this all the time. Consider here in Scandinavia, where I sit in Stockholm, neighboring countries operate 3G on spectrum, other operates 4G, other operates 2G on the same spectrum in neighboring countries. We plan for this all the time. This is a non-issue. This is something you plan and coordinate with in between the operators. The regulators are usually not even involved in these plannings between the operators. The question is a little bit how you can harmonize and how you can work together and how you know who the other users are, because I think that is usually the hard part, especially in the 400 megahertz band from time to time, to find the interfering party. It's not hard to understand that you are interfered. But it's also quite, in many cases, quite easy to sort out. And it's something you do one-off and then you're operational. So I wouldn't, I would say like this, I would not like to have spectrum sharing in the same band for utility on a nationwide network. Definitely not within the nation, but I would not be too worried about the borders. That would be, it doesn't really matter the spectrum. If you decide to build a nationwide spectrum in Luxembourg on 3.5, I guess it's they will be have equally interest in interference as we would have probably on 450 between UK and Ireland.
Yeah, I think that this will happen also in Switzerland. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosta, I have a question for you. The question is that would the panelists suggest utilities to use unlicensed spectrum for their connectivity? Do you envisage any utilization of unlicensed spectrum for utility applications? I guess no mission critical applications. Not all applications are mission critical. Yes. What do you have to comment on that?
I think from my aspect, we see quite a lot that you connect with licensed spectrum and then go across, especially internally in buildings for different kind of solutions. Of course, you can have unlicensed spectrum, but probably not for your substations or for kind of the actual distribution network. I would probably not recommend to have unlicensed spectrum. Then, of course, on facilities. I mean, if you have a power plant which is quite confined, you will not get interference from the outside. You can also use unlicensed spectrum, but I mean that's my opinion on this. I don't know if anybody else has other views on this.
I think that Julian from Colombia would like to have some comments on that, because as I understood, there are some applications, perhaps metering applications that you are using a licensed spectrum, the LoRa application, something like that. Julian, please.
Yeah, Clovis. Well, I agree that the mission critical process possibly will need most of the time a license spectrum, but I think there are also room to have unlicensed spectrum in order to provide some other kind of non-critical applications, like, for example, mesh networks for AMI could work especially in the Americas region, that we have enough spectrum, for example, in the 902, 928 megahertz band. And in my view, it is also possible to ask to the regulators to let the utilities to use unlicensed spectrum, but with a special condition that let to share that spectrum only between the utilities, and to let the other users to go to other parts of the unlicensed spectrum. And I think that there are room for both, and there are also good technologies that can handle interference. For example, these new kind of mesh networks. So I think an operator needs to have several frequencies available, and it should be able to choose between several kinds of technologies according with the specific needs of the process they are handling using spectrum.
Yeah, very interesting approach. Are there Celidonio, please?
Sorry, but I mean, the suggestion of Julian, I mean, if we give utilities a special portion of the unlicensed, that will mean that it's not more unlicensed, and we have a license spectrum or a license in order to use part of or a portion of the spectrum unlicensed. So it really does not make, I would say, it's almost impossible. Unlicensed is for everyone who wants to deploy something and use something. And so in this case, we have to say this unlicensed portion of the one for a utility, and we transform this under a license approach and identify that spectrum for this kind of services. So I cannot follow this idea really.
Any other comment on that?
Yeah, so Clovis, I think it's an interesting conversation, and I know within EUTC, quite a few members here in Europe use the 900, 873, 876 megahertz band for certain less critical activities, or maybe, as Jos just suggests, communication across site. I think the learning point from several EU utilities, it's about the criticality of the application in the unlicensed spectrum, or indeed any less reliable means of communication. Because what tends to happen is people think at the point of installation and design, that's not very critical. If it fails for a few hours or a few days, it's not a problem, I can live without it. But then people don't continually review it, and 5 years down the line, that thing fails, and by then, that asset is actually taken on a far more critical function in the network than what it was originally designed for. So that's the risk, is that unless people are constantly reviewing the criticality of the devices on a less reliable, lower cost solution, then they leave themselves open. So it's I wouldn't rule it out, but it would have to be very, very carefully managed. I guess that's the problem, especially
maybe add to that one, Julian, as we have had a lot of discussions on in Europe, especially, but I think also in parts of the US, with local power productions, or now especially with solar panels and so on. Criticality moves out quite far out in the network to be able to control power flows and so on to a large extent. So it's, as you say, it's a moving target.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Yeah, I can add that in Brazil, there are a lot of operators that they are deploying mesh networks in this frequency band, and they're using extensively for AMI applications, and with good results. I've heard about results, and they're pretty much happy with the solutions they are implementing. Yeah, there are large projects with that. Yeah. So we are just running a little bit out of time, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to for a final message from you, panelists, and I just would turn the floor to you for your final message to the audience. Perhaps in the same sequence that we started, Brett, could you please provide us your message? Yeah.
I just think that now more than ever, utilities need to focus on this spectrum issue. We've certainly managed to get by with what we've got, but we're now at a tipping point, and it's important for utilities to work with their regulators to try and make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. Julian?
Thanks, Clovis. I think to come back to some of the points earlier, I think everyone needs to remember that we're trying to very, very rapidly evolve the communications infrastructure and the energy grids in a regulatory and policy framework that's probably about 50 years out of date. And that means that we do need engagement with our political leaders and the people in government that are in charge of energy sector resilience and so on. But I think, as a few others made the point, no one's going to do this for us. So the people that are involved in the UTC community around the globe, that's a great step. If you're part of UTC or UTC or whatever, that's fantastic that you're there. But we do need more members, and we need those members to be not just be passive, but to be proactive and not to be afraid to go and speak to your elected politicians and use events like COP26, use the recent reports on climate change, use all those things at your disposal to convince people that this is important and this needs to be done. And of course, always remind them that we would absolutely love to have fiber optic connectivity to every device in the network. but we know that that's not going to happen. So yes, hence we're going to be reliant upon radio connectivity for the very long-term future, I think. So all those things, people, if they can bear in mind, and yeah, that evangelizing is absolutely key. It really is. I think we've got the technical solutions. It's the political ones and the influences that we need now. So thanks again, Clovis. Cheers.
Oh, thank you very much, Julian, for your remarks. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Gosta, please.
Yes, try to keep it brief. I think one thing is we promote quite a lot of private spectrum. I just can emphasize what everybody else is saying. Please just ask for spectrum to your regulator if you need help, if you need to be creative. We are quite creative. We have managed to drag along quite a lot of different spectrums around the world, and we're more than happy to help out, even if it's not 400 megahertz spectrum, but we work trying to get the full range of spectrum to work in parallel. So we're more than happy to support anybody with both questions and support at the regulators, which we also talk to quite a lot on a regular basis. And it's been a lot of talk about 450 during this event. So I can just advertise again. If you're interested in even more information about 450, we have our event in a couple of weeks. Go and register on our webpage. So yeah, well, that's all for me. Thank you, Clovis, and very good event so far.
Thank you very much. I like very much the concept of ecosystem harmonization. Very interesting. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to my dear friend, Julian Gomez Pineda. Julian, your final remarks.
Okay, thank you, Clovis. Well, I think that the way to handle this approach with the governments regarding the spectrum that is needed for the electricity sector needs to emphasize a message, and is what is the spectrum for in each country? What is the best allocation possible of the spectrum? How does the spectrum is getting benefits to the citizens? How the spectrum can help to provide a better energy service to the people, an affordable service to the people, because it doesn't make sense that we make a digitalization of the sector and that the benefits don't go directly to the people in terms of a better service or a lower cost, but the cost to give the digitalization is equal or higher than the benefits that the people is getting. So that's the kind of message that I think is important to give to the regulators in the countries. What is the spectrum for? What is the best way to maximize the social welfare for the people with the spectrum usage?
Well, thank you very much, Julian. I think that this is our permanent job. We need to keep evangelizing our policymakers and our regulators. And I thank you very much for your participation. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my dear Clovis.
Now I'd like to turn to my dear friend Celidonio for your final remarks. Celidonio.
Thank you, Clovis. I could say be active and work together with government/politicians in order to identify dedicated spectrum for utilities/verticals. I mean, work also together with verticals and start using 4G LTE Advanced for your networks in order to start taking advantage of what the technology can offer to the utilities. And finally, focus on 3GPP technology.
Well, thank you very much. Very wise advice. Appreciate it, Celidonio. Thank you for your participation. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to John Yaldwin for your final remarks, please.
Thank you. Well, I think everyone else has hammered the utilities, the obligation for utilities to contact governments and regulators. I do say, though, please don't assume that someone else is doing that job. If you have any contact with politicians, you need to have the conversation going about utility access to spectrum. The second point I'd like to make is please don't assume that someone else is going to find spectrum for you. You know, spend the time to look at your national spectrum allocations, ask questions. What is this block of spectrum being used for? Could we use it in some way? Obviously, we want the spectrum to be aligned with the 3GPP band, and that's a good place to start. And even when I look at the spectrum allocations in highly populated countries, I still find opportunities that I believe could be made possible if there's a willingness, but often there is not a willingness. I often find the door to spectrum allocations is shut because it's too hard, or because the regulator is not really sure of the usage. These are very common excuses to do nothing, and you have to put it the other way around and say, well, if you can't find a good reason why we won't use the spectrum, can we run a pilot and let's see who is upset? The third point I want to make is that, you know, unlicensed spectrum is attractive to some extent, but there are drawbacks. And a classic example is once you allow an unlicensed band to be used widely for metering, then actually that band ends up becoming a metering band because every house becomes a source of interference to other users, and you can get pushback. It is much better that metering is done on properly licensed frequencies. I think the desire to use unlicensed frequencies comes from the lack of licensed spectrum. But licensed spectrum takes work. You need to make the political case for it, and you need to do the technical investigation. The last thing is to look at technological means to allow sharing. The CBRS band in the United States is one example. There are many other techniques and technologies that allow for sharing. If we say that we must have exclusive spectrum, then the number of opportunities will be greatly reduced. We have to look at sharing. We have to look at the way in which technology can promote sharing in networks. And I believe it is possible to live with our neighbors and share spectrum. It does take work. And lastly, you know, why are we doing this? It's not because we just want to make money as a utility. It's because the current global climate crisis really forces us to work quickly to reduce carbon emissions, to recognize that renewables are critical to this world's future. Thank you. And obrigado.
Oh, thank you very much for your final remarks. Very relevant points you have raised, and we really appreciate. And I think that this panel would enable us to develop new ideas, new concepts. We can organize new events with our associates, and we are really grateful to the participation of all of you. Well, I personally have learned a lot in 2 hours. Very, very good discussions, and I really would like to thank you all for your participation. I have been asked by UTC direction, UTCAL, to provide some information. First of all, UTCAL would like to thank you for your participation very much. And they are informing that we had 1,600 registered people, a lot of interest, and more than 1,000 participants during the week. And they also are recalling that we have plans to have a presential summit March 2022 in Rio de Janeiro. And I look forward to seeing you there, March 2022. And I look forward to that the pandemics would not prevent us to organize this next presidential summit. And I wish you all the best and stay well and with excellent health. I thank you very much, you all, and my pleasure to having you on board of this event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clovis.
Happy Friday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Let's have some beer now. Thank you.
Like that.
Yeah.
Cerveja.